What if the secret to becoming the world's strongest mage wasn't noble blood, ancient talent, or a mountain of gold, but just reading 150 history books while accidentally chopping firewood in a mental void? Meet Sharon, a commoner kid who turns insight into a cheat code, accidentally befriends a noble meathead, survives execution for crossing class lines, and proves magic is basically advanced philosophy with extra steps. The story starts with a baby crying somewhere near a house in the middle of the mountains. Right after, a man grabbed his axe while saying that he believed that a rat had snuck in. He also added that if they had gone to rob the house, they were pretty unlucky because that house belonged to a hunter. The man went outside and began to search for the intruder, while thinking that the intruder was not your average person, since they had avoided all the traps and hid their presence. However, they couldn't fool the man's ears. Shortly after, he seemed to locate the target and thought that he would kill them so quickly that they wouldn't have time to retaliate. Nevertheless, when he burst in at the stables, there was no one there. That confused the man, who began to wonder if he was hallucinating because he was told that they couldn't have a baby. However, at that moment, he was completely shocked because he saw a blonde baby sleeping very close to him. The man immediately grabbed the baby to confirm that he was alive, and when he did, the man's expression softened a lot. Shortly after, a woman arrived at the stables and asked the man, whose name was Vincent, what was wrong and why he was making a fuss. That startled him, but he quickly asked the woman, whose name was Alina, if she had woken up. Nevertheless, before he could say anything else, the woman noticed the baby and immediately closed the distance, trying to look closely at the infant, which made the man tense. Vincent then asked her what about it, and almost immediately, they concluded that it was their child. Something magical happened then, his closed eyes opened, and he shook his hands, the wind blew, and the clouds started to gather. Soon after, rain fell from those clouds, the dried-up land started to glisten, and the village people sang songs of joy. He also started to protect the village from outside threats, and because of his mysterious powers, the village found peace. No villagers went thirsty or hungry. However, the village people did not have access to scientific research. Thus, the people thought his powers were mysterious, and he was called a mage. At that moment, Vincent interrupted our protagonist, whose name was Sharon Arian, asking if he was reading a book. Our protagonist, who was already 12 years old, quickly closed the book and greeted her father, who was 40 years old at that moment. Almost immediately, Vincent grabbed the kid and began to spin while telling him that he had already found enough wood, which meant that it was time to go home and eat. Then, while Vincent put his son back on the ground and hugged him, our protagonist said that he was curious about something and asked him what he would need to do to use magic. That surprised Vincent, who quickly wondered if the book he had given his son was about that. Right after, Vincent asked his son if magic was really something else. After all, with one arrow you could kill a bear, and with one strike of an axe you could fell a tree. In the man's eyes, that was what you called magic. At that moment, they met with two young boys who immediately noticed the pair. One of the kids, the thin one, then told the other, the sturdy one, that they always asked Sharon to play with them, but he was always reading books. After hearing that, the sturdy boy noticed the huge book our protagonist was carrying and asked the other if it was a lie that our protagonist could read, before adding that Sharon was scrawny and didn't look like his father at all. Finally, he added that his mom said that he was not Vincent's real son, and that his real parents had abandoned him because he was weird. What they didn't know was that Vincent was eavesdropping. Of course, what they said made the man angry, to the point that he had to clench his fists, trying to remain calm. However, he then became worried, thinking that Sharon had also heard them. However, our protagonist simply smiled and repeated the words his father had just said about falling a tree with one strike, before saying that it was magic. Right after, Vincent told his son that since Sharon had helped his dad that day, he would take our protagonist to the city the following day to buy him a lot of his favorite fruit, which made the kid feel elated. Nevertheless, Vincent could only mentally apologize to our protagonist for being a lacking father. However, he also thought that, no matter what anyone said, Sharon was his son. On the other hand, our protagonist was thinking that he wanted to know more about magic. The following day, they both arrived at Krias, a city in the rural part of the kingdom of Thormia, and our protagonist looked very happy since that was, apparently, his first time going there. A while later, Vincent told Sharon that, until he finished all his work, he needed to wait for him at Martin's grandfather's shop. The man also warned his son against going into dark alleys and running into the nobles, even though our protagonist had never gone against what he said. In fact, Sharon quickly replied that his father shouldn't have to worry. Shortly after, Sharon began to help the old man by writing a signboard, and the old man immediately praised our protagonist because he wrote very well, before adding that he didn't need to do it, to which the kid replied that it was fine because he wanted to help. After hearing that, the old man thought that even though Sharon was young, he was quite bright, unlike Martin, who was the town's troublemaker. Right after, our protagonist pulled the old man out of his reverie by asking him if he knew what magic was. However, the old man didn't understand the question, and Sharon explained that he wanted to know what he needed to do to be able to use magic. It was then that the old man apparently understood the question. Then, while looking at the book Sharon was reading, the old man replied that he didn't know about magic either, before adding that if our protagonist was looking for books about it, there were a lot of them in a place in a store located in front of them. The moment Sharon noticed there was a bookstore nearby, he got very happy. The old man then asked him if he wanted to go, before telling him to look around for a bit and return. Our protagonist couldn't believe that he was allowed to go there, and immediately began to run toward the bookstore while saying that he would be right back. The old man then opened the book our protagonist was reading to take a look at it, while thinking that when he was young, he read those children's books too. However, when the man began to read the book, he was completely shocked because its content was extremely complex. In fact, it was then that the old man truly understood what our protagonist meant when he asked him how he could use magic. Meanwhile, someone was slapping our protagonist's hand away from some book while yelling at him that he couldn't touch those books with his dirty hands. Right after, an embarrassed Sharon asked the woman if he could just have a little look at the book. However, the woman immediately replied that a commoner couldn't look at those expensive books, before asking if he believed that those books were the same as the practical books sold in general stores. And the woman didn't stop there. She also asked our protagonist what he was going to do if those books looked second-hand after he had touched them with his dirty hands. After hearing that, Sharon realized that those books were very expensive and began to wonder where his dad had bought the book he was reading. At that moment, a man arrived and asked if all the books he had ordered had arrived. Almost immediately, the woman turned around to greet the newcomer, who happened to be the landlord, and told him that all of them had arrived before asking him how he would like to pay for them. Meanwhile, our protagonist was leafing through another book's pages eagerly while thinking that it was the same, and that there was not much information. A while later, he was outside the bookstore and said that he didn't think that it was that hard to read a book. At that moment, he saw the landlord walking away carrying a box filled with books. Almost immediately, he began to follow the middle-aged man while wondering if he was a noble and where he was going. Wow, so much for not going against what his father said. Some time later, our protagonist saw the man throwing away all the books in a pile of garbage, and the kid immediately picked up one, while wondering if that was the place where his dad had gotten the other book from. Sharon then noticed there were two noblewomen chatting nearby, and he began to wonder how they were different from him. He then recalled his dad's warning about not running into nobles. Still, he walked toward them while wondering why they were allowed, and he wasn't. However, before he could get much closer, a man who looked like a policeman stopped him and told him that that was not a place where a kid like him could go around by himself. The officer of the law then explained that beyond the gate where they were standing was the area for nobles. Right after, the man asked him where he had come from and where his parents were, which made Sharon feel nervous, so he quickly replied that his parents were around there. At that moment, another policeman arrived and told the first one that our protagonist looked suspicious, before adding that he didn't believe he was a child who lived there. After hearing that, the first policeman said that he was sure Sharon was an orphan, and that he might be an errand boy whom those thieves were raising. Almost immediately, he told our protagonist that he needed to go with them. But it was then that the police noticed that he was only grabbing Sharon's jacket, since the kid had skipped away without him noticing it. Right after, he asked where the kid had gone, and his partner told him that he had to find him quickly. After all, it was embarrassing to lose a child. After both policemen left, our protagonist, who was hiding behind some planter boxes and bushes, double-checked to confirm that they were gone before going back, saying that he was going to get in trouble from his dad. Then, while he was putting his shoes back on, he heard a conversation where a headmaster was teaching their student about what magic was. Of course, that caught his attention, and he began to eavesdrop. Apparently, the student didn't want to talk about the concept of magic, but wanted the headmaster to teach them how to extinguish the fire. At that moment, Sharon guessed that the place on the other side of the wall was a magic school. The other person then replied that they would get into trouble if they used fire at school. So the headmaster offered the student a deal if the student could get a certain question correct. The headmaster would show them magic. The headmaster then asked what talent was needed the most in order to learn magic, and the student immediately replied that it was wisdom. Right after, another student said that it was effort, since you needed to study magic for your whole life. Then, a third student replied that it was money, since it seemed like you needed to buy a lot of things. That last answer made everyone laugh. Nevertheless, the students let the headmaster know that they had yet to say the answer, which made our protagonist think that it was not wisdom, effort, or money. Chiron then wondered if you needed to be a noble to be able to use magic. Right after, the headmaster said that the talent that was most crucial to learning magic was insight. After hearing that, one of the students asked what insight was, and the headmaster immediately asked them if they knew what 1-for-1 was. After hearing that, one of the students said that it was 2, before asking who wouldn't know something so obvious. The headmaster, who was an old man, then smiled and asked the students if anyone could explain why it was 2, to which one of them replied that it was because it was obvious. The headmaster then said the weird feeling they had at that moment was what was called insight, before adding that those who lived long before didn't know that 1-for-1 was 2 until the efforts from countless scholars proved that it was. The old man kept his lecture by saying that they currently understood that 1-for-1 was 2 without needing the complicated verification. He then added that, because of the existing rules, beyond knowing things you learnt, there were things that you needed to feel and accept through conceptualization. And as magic, too, was a law that existed within the world, you needed to feel it wholly and accept it through your insight. After hearing that, one of the students concluded that insight was more accurate than wisdom and faster than effort, and another replied that it was ingenious. Right after, the headmaster began to laugh and said that it was indeed ingenious, before adding that if you cultivated your talent, you could become a mage. Obviously, our protagonist couldn't help but be moved by those words, and he immediately wondered if the chance to become a mage would arrive for him, too. At that moment, the headmaster spoke directly to Chiron and asked him what his thoughts were, which caught the kid by surprise. Still, he didn't immediately run away. Instead, he began to wonder if he needed to flee or reply. Moreover, he was aware that he looked like a mess at that moment, and he didn't know what would happen if he replied. All of a sudden, a thought came to him. If he didn't jump over that wall, he would regret it forever. So, he didn't hesitate anymore and climbed the wall. Once he did it, he could see the headmaster, who was sitting near a nearby tree, along with several young kids. Right after, the old man, who was Milch Alpes, headmaster of Alpea's Magic Academy and a 4th-class official mage, asked Chiron if he had gone to accompany him, and our protagonist prepared himself to jump to the other side of the wall. Almost immediately, the students began complaining by saying that our protagonist was not a noble, and that he was a lowly commoner. In fact, some students directly told Chiron that he couldn't be there and that he had to go away. Nevertheless, the headmaster simply began to laugh before saying that it was fine. Right after, he asked our protagonist to get closer before asking Chiron what part of what the old man said had convinced them to jump the wall. Almost immediately, our protagonist replied that he wanted to see magic, and the headmaster asked him if he had never seen magic before. Chiron quickly confirmed it before adding that he had only read about it in books, but he had never seen it in person. Right after, one of the students called our protagonist a liar because there was no way a lowly commoner could read books. Still, our protagonist ignored him and bowed to the headmaster while asking him to show him magic before adding that it didn't matter what kind of magic it was. Almost immediately, the old man began to laugh while saying that it was no big deal. Then the headmaster said that he was about to show him the magic of wind. Almost immediately, he cast a wind spell, which amazed the students. However, at first, our protagonist didn't understand what the magic was because he couldn't see anything. Suddenly, Chiron, along with other students, were sent flying upward, which made them feel elated. Well, our protagonist was feeling astonished instead. Shortly after, Chiron tried to move and regain his balance to no avail. Moreover, things got worse in his head when he began to fall. In fact, he ended up curling into a ball, trembling with fear, since he was sure that he was going to crash. However, in the end, he didn't and just floated a few centimeters above the ground, while the students laughed and pointed at him. Right after, the headmaster asked him how it had been, before saying that it was magic. Then, a flabbergasted Chiron asked if that had truly been magic. The old man then stroked his long beard pensively, and our protagonist quickly added that it didn't matter if he didn't understand the explanation, since he just wanted to know what exactly magic was. After hearing that, the other student began to criticize Chiron due to the way in which he was talking to the headmaster. After all, even teachers couldn't act like that towards the old man. However, the headmaster didn't get angry. Instead, he began to laugh before saying that he would speak in some difficult terms. The old man then began to explain that magic was something that surpassed logic. In other words, it was mental activity that explored the truth of a phenomenon. He then asked Chiron if that had been too hard to understand. Shortly after, our protagonist explained that since it was an illogical phenomenon, perhaps because of that, it made it closer to the truth, which astonished all the students. As for Milch Alpes, he suddenly began to laugh out loud before asking if that was also written in the books. However, Chiron said that it was not, before explaining that he had found a common point in the books. A lot of famous people's thoughts were made fun of at first for not being normal, but they eventually accepted it as the foundation of new logic. So, our protagonist thought that perhaps the truth was hidden in the unusual. Again, the students had no idea of what Sharon was talking about, but the old man, who was stroking his beard again, said that our protagonist was right. Sharon then asked how he could learn magic. At that point, Milch thought that the kid was a wise child who wanted to research on his own by collecting accurate information, even though it was difficult. The old man then wondered if our protagonist really believed that he could do it. However, in the end, Sharon was a commoner, and that was a shame in Milch's eyes. Still, the headmaster didn't ignore the kid's question, and said that instead of a detailed explanation, he should show him a demonstration. Almost immediately, he ordered one of the students, whose name was Shaman, to head into the spirit zone. Afterward, a purple-haired young girl replied that she would do it right away. And while our protagonist wondered what the spirit zone was, the girl announced, while showing a blue shine from her eyes, that she had entered the zone. Immediately thereafter, the old man showed her his closed fist and asked how many coins were in his hand, to which she replied that there were 6. Milch then opened his hand and showed the 6 coins, which made our protagonist wonder how the girl had done it. The headmaster then explained that when a mage focused, the mind became so sensitive that they could sense everything around them. Besides, skilled mages could even sense the number of leaves on the ground from far away. That was the extremely sensitive mindset, spirit zone. Almost immediately, the girl, whose eyes were closed, announced that there were only 3 coins at that moment. Afterward, while Milch opened his hand again to show the 3 coins, he explained that mages in the zone could sense the outside world in an extrasensory way and control the phenomenon. After seeing that, Chiron thought that the coins had not been counted, and that the situation in front of him had been sensed as a whole, so he began to believe that perhaps he could also do it. As if guessing the kid's thoughts, the old man said that anyone could do it. He even gave him some instructions. He had to find a quiet place to practice. Afterward, he had to first feel himself, then he had to erase. Erase what? What kind of instruction is that? It was then that Chiron realized that even though anyone could do it, not everyone could actually do it. Right after, Milch said that if our protagonist could do that, then a whole new world would open. Afterward, the headmaster asked Chiron if he had understood it, and our protagonist replied that if you couldn't feel yourself, erasing yourself would also be impossible. After hearing that, the old man laughed internally, while thinking that the kid kept surprising him. Right after, he asked Chiron if he would try it right there and then. The headmaster then thought that, no matter what, if the kid couldn't go into the spirit zone, he wouldn't be able to learn magic itself. Almost immediately, our protagonist closed his eyes and began to focus while telling himself that he was to feel himself. Right after, he asked himself what his self was. At first, he thought that it was his brain, but he quickly dismissed the idea because the brain was just a body part. Nevertheless, the senses and reality he felt couldn't escape the idea of a brain. However, he knew that instead of defining it, he had to feel it. He had to erase the things that he felt were on him one by one. At some point, he could feel how the existence of himself was not becoming sensitive, only his mind was. Then, he finally opened his eyes. Right after, the headmaster asked him how he felt, and he simply replied that he could hear all the sounds. That made all the students mock him because it was easy to hear the sound while standing still. Meanwhile, the old man confirmed what he had already concluded, that our protagonist couldn't do it. After all, the things that happened in the spirit world were in another dimension. That was synesthesia, smell from sound, taste of light, the shape of scenery touching the skin, etc. Afterward, the headmaster patted the kid's head and told him that if he worked hard, he would be able to hear even more sounds. Then, the old man took the students back while telling them that the special class had ended, thinking that it was unfortunate because Chiron was a kid with talent. In fact, he was sure that if that child were a noble and trained from a young age, he would have had similar achievements to the students who were there. However, there were too many talented kids in the world. In the meantime, our protagonist climbed the wall and jumped to the other side while saying that it had really worked. Okay, so we are following the underestimated protagonist trope here. I just hope this trope doesn't last long. Our protagonist heard a booming sound and began to wonder if that really was the spirit zone. Moreover, he felt like he had been separated into tiny pieces and spread far and wide around the world. In short, he had become the world. Nevertheless, the endless vastness made him shudder, and he ended up crying while running back. Even though it had been just for a moment, our protagonist had broken away from his physical form and had become infinity. Sadly, he was so absorbed in his thoughts that he was not paying proper attention to his surroundings and ended up bumping into a man. Chiron fell to the floor and apologized, but the man, who looked like a thug and who was not alone, got angry and grabbed our protagonist by his collar. The thug then asked Chiron if he had gone nuts, before adding that our protagonist needed to pay the price for hitting the man. That made the kid feel nervous, and Chiron only managed to apologize again while stuttering. Unfortunately, the man disregarded the kid's apology and asked him if he was a member of the wolf gang before asking if our protagonist had gone there to kill him. I've seen lame excuses to do bad deeds, but this one is just pathetic. Right after, someone arrived at the scene and asked the thugs what they were doing and if something fun had happened. When the thug who was grabbing Sharon turned around, he immediately recognized the person as Lady Amy, which stunned him. Almost immediately, the newcomer asked them what they were doing there and if they had become bored again. On the other hand, our protagonist took a look at Lady Amy, who was a young girl around his own age, while thinking that he needed to beg her to save him. However, he quickly noticed that she was very young and that she was a noble. And, before he could think of anything else, the thug who was grabbing him told the girl that our protagonist had tried to kill him, which was why he was about to teach him a lesson. Almost immediately, Sharon said that the man was lying, before adding that he had accidentally bumped into him. Right after, another thug kneed the little kid, while telling him that it was laughable for him to expect they would believe that. Then, while our protagonist was on the ground coughing, one of the thugs told him that he needed to pay the price before asking him where his mother was. Right after, another thug told Sharon that he should call his good-for-nothing mother for giving birth to a punk like him. That began to awaken some killing intent in our protagonist, and one of the thugs noticed it. That thug then mockingly asked the kid if they had hurt his feelings before kicking him in the head while saying that he was an arrogant bastard, and daring him to try that one more time. Immediately thereafter, all the thugs began to kick him, and one of them even told the others to be careful not to leave bruises on his face. Shortly after, the young girl approached and told the thugs to stop because they were going to kill our protagonist. The thugs complied and moved away, opening a path for the young lady who walked toward Sharon while asking him if he was fine. Of course, he's fine. Nothing better than a good beating to make you feel renewed. The kid then turned his head to look at the girl and told her, while crying, that he hadn't done anything. Almost immediately, the girl looked at the thugs and told them that they should stop that, before asking them if there was anything more fun they could do. Okay, this lady is evil, and here I was thinking of her as a potential female lead, my goodness. Right after, one of the thugs said that he was thinking of shaking our protagonist up before selling him off to the southern village. After all, since he was a commoner, there would be no backlash. Obviously, those words shocked Sharon, and he began to think of his mom and dad. Well, if he manages to escape from that, I hope he listens to his parents from that moment onward. In the end, all of that was his fault. After a short pause, the girl asked if, in order to be a slave, the kid couldn't have any possessions, but before the others could reply, she proposed, while blushing, to confirm if the kid didn't have any possessions. This girl is beyond redemption, unless that is all an act. Immediately thereafter, the thugs began to laugh while saying that they would do a full body inspection. Of course, that shocked our protagonist, and since he was almost motionless, one of the thugs demanded that he begin stripping down if he didn't want to be hit again. After hearing that, the girl blushed even more while thinking that those bastards were crazy. After all, she had meant that they should take a look at his face. Right after, she began to wonder what was up with our protagonist. Her plan was tormenting him a bit, then letting him go, but at that point, she was seriously wondering if he had gone insane. Again, this girl is hopeless. However, I am beginning to suspect she is not going to face any consequence for her actions. This is a hunch, but I think she is going to be a female lead or female lead at some point, which will grant her total immunity. Suddenly, while all the men were laughing, something unexpected happened. Our protagonist somehow entered the spirit zone, and recalled the moment when the headmaster showed him wind magic. Almost immediately, something began to affect his memory. Meanwhile, one of the thugs grew impatient since our protagonist remained motionless and grabbed the kid by the collar while telling him, asking if the kid was ignoring him. At that moment, the girl tried to intervene, but before she could do anything, all the men were sent flying upward. Shortly after, all the thugs fell to the ground and ended up breaking some of their limbs. Well, this confirms my theory. Somehow, the spell did not affect the girl.
Coincidence? I think not!
Immediately thereafter, the girl called the kid out, asking him who the heck he was and where he had learned magic. The young lady, whose eyes were shining with a strange red light, couldn't believe that a commoner could use magic. Nevertheless, at that moment, someone said that there had been some kind of loud sound nearby, and almost immediately, she jumped to the roof of one of the nearby buildings, which astonished Sharon since he couldn't understand how she could move like that. Did you forget that she was bullying you a few seconds ago? Please, don't start simping. Please afterward, some people appeared nearby, and one of them said that someone had collapsed where our protagonist was, which pulled him out of his reverie. Right after, he thought that people wouldn't listen to someone like him, so he decided to run away like a bat out of hell, while thinking of his dad and that the world was harsh. Sometime later, at the household of a first-class noble family called Karmas, the young girl was cursing out loud, saying that she couldn't believe that she was bested by some brat. Right after, a man, who was drinking coffee while reading a newspaper, told the girl that he was home early that day. That man was Shakura Karmas, head of the household, and he quickly asked her if she had skipped class and wandered around again, which bothered Amy, who quickly replied that she had learned everything there was to learn, before adding that it was no fun. After hearing that, the man sighed and asked rhetorically when she would grow up. Then, he told her that, even though she was a genius, if she stayed complacent, she could get taken by surprise one day. Those words hit hard because she, who was stomping while going upstairs, suddenly stopped in her tracks and began to tremble. On the other hand, the man thought that she was quiet that day because, in normal circumstances, she would have rebutted his claim. Suddenly, she asked her dad about magic, and he asked her what she was talking about all of a sudden, to which she replied by asking him to introduce her to someone at a magic school. During a snowy day, Vincent was at his house looking for his son, and his wife told him that his son had already left for the lumberyard to get more wood. After hearing that, the man said that the snow hadn't even stopped falling yet, which was why he couldn't understand why he had gone for more wood. Then, he said that he would see if he could find him. Shortly after, while looking for the kid, the man thought that, last spring, when he had taken Sharon to the city, he had nearly lost him. Back then, our protagonist had merely said that he had gotten lost, but Vincent wondered what had actually happened. Meanwhile, our protagonist was getting ready to cut down a tree with his axe, thinking he hadn't been able to use the magic activated that day again since. A magic he had been able to use subconsciously. He was aware that there was no way to tell what had happened through insight, because the process was omitted. Moreover, there was no knowledge of magic. However, he had already confirmed that it was possible to enter the spirit zone. In fact, he immediately entered the spirit zone and thought that, while there, he could sense everything. The sensation, the form, and the scent. He could feel everything. He couldn't exactly express what he felt, but he could feel it. Right after, he hit the tree with the axe and obliterated it, while thinking that he could even cut down a tree with one swing while in that zone. Unbeknownst to him, his father, who was hidden behind a nearby tree, was totally flabbergasted because he had just seen the little kid using a technique called Thunder Strike. Back with Sharon, he thought that it was merely one success out of 100 attempts, like the magic from that day. On the other hand, the man who was holding a book began to silently cry while watching his son. Vincent then thought that Sharon needed actual knowledge, not just luck. So, the following day, and the day after that, they would repeat it endlessly, for the opportunity that might appear one day. 3 years later, Sharon was standing in front of a tree while holding his axe, thinking that he didn't see it through his eyes. Rather, his eyes felt it. Right after, he cut down the tree with only one swing and said that he had nearly gone home after just meditating. At that moment, he had managed to remain in the spirit zone for 5 hours. He then thought that it felt like he had become one with nature. He could sense the shift of the greenery, the squirming of worms, and the sound of trees absorbing water. In fact, if he wanted to leisurely take in everything, 5 hours was not enough time. He then recalled the headmaster's words about feeling a different world by entering the spirit zone, and the young boy thought that the old man had given him a very accurate description. Right after, he decided to go back home. At his house, he saw a couple of white horses and a luxurious carriage, and wondered if there was a guest there. Then, he entered and was surprised after seeing his parents talking to a middle-aged man. Once his father noticed that he had returned, Vincent asked his son to greet their guest before saying that he was the associate butler of the Ogent family. Immediately thereafter, the butler, whose name was Temeran, introduced himself while showing a hard expression. I don't like where this is going. We are heading directly toward the commoner, being mistreated by a nasty, noble family arc. Sharon quickly bowed toward the man while introducing himself, and Temeran stood up while saying that he was there to meet him. Right after, the butler patted our protagonist's shoulder and asked him to let him take a look at him first. In the meantime, Sharon thought that the Ogent family was the second highest nobility after royalty before wondering why someone like the butler, who worked for nobles, would look for the young boy. Almost immediately, Temeran hostilely grabbed Sharon's chin while asking our protagonist if he knew how to read, to which the young boy replied that he had been reading books since he was little. Afterward, the butler turned our protagonist around, checking his body, and Sharon asked the man why he was doing that, to which Temeran replied that the young boy's reputation was quite good. A mountaineer's son who knew how to read, and he was very filial as well. Right after, he asked him if he would like to work for the Ogent family, which shocked the young boy. The butler then explained that they were going to be transferring everything that was in the great library of the main house. Out of 10,000 books that were there, some couldn't be disclosed to the public. Besides, the time limit was 2 years. The physical labor would be done by the servants, but the sorting would be done solely by the butler and our protagonist. After hearing that, Sharon was astonished because he would be able to work at the library, and he was sure that the Ogent family's library contained classified knowledge for mages. Then, the butler added that the only people who would know about that transfer project would be his family. So, if for any reason the books were leaked, or a rumor started that they had been leaked, our protagonist and his family were as good as dead. It was then that Sharon understood why his parents had very serious expressions. Afterward, Temiran said that he would pay our protagonist handsomely since he would be risking his life. In fact, it would be an amount he could never earn even during a good hunting season, which meant that Vincent would be reaping the benefits by bringing up a good child. Almost immediately, Vincent was triggered and yelled to the butler that money was not the reason they wanted to hear him out. Our protagonist's dad then lowered his voice and added that he merely wanted Sharon to be able to achieve his dreams. After hearing that, the butler began to laugh out loud while asking Vincent what he was thinking, and if he truly thought that Sharon was going to become something. In the end, he was sure that our protagonist's dad had requested him to hire Sharon because of the money, and not for some romantic reason. Vincent then yelled at the butler, reminding him that he had said that our protagonist would be able to read books. Temiran then replied that Sharon would indeed be able to do it. However, it would be impossible to monitor at all times. Almost immediately, the butler dropped a huge bomb by asking Vincent if he had been lying to his son the entire time by telling him that he wanted Sharon to achieve his dreams. Those words hit hard and made Vincent recall some memories of his little kid reading books. He remembered that Alina had taught our protagonist a few words for fun, but by the time he was 6 years old, he was able to read on his own. Sharon's appearance stood out. He looked like a noble, and above all, he was highly intelligent, which was why Vincent wondered if he could be from a royal family. Moreover, he thought that if our protagonist had been brought up by a noble, he could have been educated in school, and that thought made him feel disheartened. Nevertheless, in the end, he told himself that our protagonist was his son, so he shouldn't think those things. After all, if Sharon was the son of a mountaineer, he should learn the trade of the mountains. However, when the boy started working in the mountains, Vincent got scared, after thinking that, ultimately, he had brought up that child as the son of a mountaineer. Then, he went to find the butler and kneeled in front of him, begging him to hire his son if he needed a commoner who knew how to read. He even said that his son had been able to read fluently since he was a child, and that he was very smart. He just wanted the butler to let his son read some books. Back to the present, Vincent, who was trembling, told the butler that they didn't need a single penny from him before adding that if he had known that things would turn out that way, he would not have begged Temiran like that. Almost immediately, and while crying, Vincent yelled at the butler, demanding that he get out of his house at once. Vincent was very angry and couldn't believe that the butler had actually mocked his family for having little money. On the other hand, the butler simply thought that it couldn't be helped since there were people who didn't know their place. Nevertheless, Sharon quickly told his father that he was willing to do it, which shocked Vincent. After hearing that, Temiran asked our protagonist if he was serious before adding that he was not just trying to scare him. The butler even reiterated that even the smallest rumor would have their neck cut off. Still, the young boy said that it was fine before asking the butler to let him do it. Right after, our protagonist added that he would never leak the information. However, Sharon went as far as to say that even if things went wrong, he wouldn't resent the butler for it. Temiran smiled after hearing that and replied that if the young boy was that invested, he would return to pick him up in a week. The butler then added that if our protagonist changed his mind before then, it was okay to decline, but once he went to the manor, there was no going back. In fact, he would never be able to leave until it was over. Once the butler left, Vincent yelled at Sharon, asking him why he had accepted that kind of thing, before adding that those bastards needed someone to die for them. The man even said that it was his fault, which was why he would take responsibility. Thus, our protagonist was free to decline the offer. However, the young boy turned around and faced his father with a big smile while blushing before thanking him for giving him such a big gift. Obviously, that made Vincent cry. Right after, Vincent hugged his son while telling him that he didn't have to worry because he could be sure that his father would protect him. Our protagonist only needed to return safely, and he would make sure that they wouldn't be able to lay a finger on his family. It was then that Vincent wondered if he had really raised his son well. In case you were wondering, Alina was silently crying while watching the scene. 1 week later, they went to pick our protagonist up and gave a contract to Vincent since he needed to sign it on behalf of his son. Once the man did, the people from the Ogent family quickly took Sharon and prepared to depart, since they were in a hurry. Once the young boy was inside the carriage, he entered the spirit zone and was able to see her parents hugging and desperately crying. However, he didn't let that shake him, because he had been given a chance of a lifetime, even though it was a double-edged sword. He then wondered if he would be able to safely survive 2 years among people with immense power. The Ojent family's house was located inside the city of Krias, near the capital Bashuka, in the kingdom of Thormia. They were a warrior family that often raised official swordsmen. The predecessor family head was an official 3rd-class swordsman, and the current head, Bishop Ojent, was an official 4th-class knight. In short terms, they were in control of the forces of power in the city. At that moment, the man who was explaining those things to our protagonist showed him the famous Ojent family's attraction, the Great Walkway. Almost immediately, the carriage stopped, and an astonished young boy got out along with the 2 men who had gone to pick him up. After seeing our protagonist's reaction, the man who was explaining things before teased the young boy by asking him if he was already scared, before adding that the family was full of monsters. Almost immediately, the other man warned the first one because he could be hanged for saying that. Right after, they told our protagonist to follow them, and Sharon thought that it was starting to feel like reality. He began to walk, and while he was seeing all the surroundings, he thought that he had arrived at a 2nd-class noble house, the Ojent family. Shortly after, the trio arrived at a building, and one of them said that it was the office as well as the lodging for the butlers. Moreover, it would be the place where the young boy would be staying. Well, apparently, he won't be sleeping in the stables, so I guess it is a good start. Afterward, he arrived at Temiran's office, and the butler immediately stood and began walking, telling our protagonist he would explain his tasks before asking the young boy to follow him. Soon after, they arrived at the great library of the Ojents, and our protagonist was stunned by how huge the place was. Temiran then told the boy that the books there would be moved to the new library, and the task of our protagonist was to organize them. He would be given a list every week, and he should find and put those books together. Work was from 9 in the morning to 6 in the evening. It was free time after that. Nevertheless, he couldn't go outside, and he couldn't enter the manor without special permission. Right after, the man gave Sharon some papers while adding that the common butler would teach him the butler rules. Temiran then asked the boy if he had any questions. After hearing the question, the young boy thought that it was worth risking his life, and then he asked the butler when he could start, to which Temiran replied that he could start the following day. Sometime later, Chiron, dressed like a butler, placed a lot of documents on a table while thinking that he understood why one person had to take on the book organization task. After all, the organizational standard should be consistent. For example, if he were to organize a book called The History of Swordsmanship, each person would have a different opinion on whether it should go into the professional swordsmanship category or the comprehensive history category. Furthermore, another thing he had found out while undergoing the systems of organization was that all knowledge was connected, and the backbone that connected it all was history. Knowledge was stacked on a line called history, so history was the backbone of knowledge. After learning history thoroughly and using it to reinforce other areas, learning became faster. Across 10,000 books, there were around 850 history books, and our protagonist decided that he would read them all in the 2 years he had there to achieve his dream as a mage. Of course, he was aware that he couldn't let himself be seen reading, because it was not officially allowed. Later, Temiran was checking a paper he received from our protagonist, and the butler asked him if he was organizing well, and if he was working overtime again, which our protagonist confirmed. Right after, the butler began to walk away while telling Chiron that he still had a long way to go, so he shouldn't ruin his condition too fast. After all, he had to take all the responsibility. Nevertheless, Temiran suddenly turned back and quickly patted our protagonist's shoulder, which made Chiron wonder if he had been caught reading during overtime hours. The butler then told the young boy that, in that library, not only butlers, but also the family head and the young masters went in, so Chiron had to take good care of his uniform and make sure not to lower the quality of the Ojent family. Moreover, he had to do something about his long hair. Almost immediately, our protagonist, while trembling, bid the butler farewell, thinking that he had to be focused for 2 years and that he had to be careful not to get into any trouble. Then, he wondered if he should tie his hair like his dad. Afterward, he was reading a book regarding the 3 emperors and the 7 kingdoms, while thinking that just the Thormia kingdom alone was hard, and wondering how he could understand that much, and if he would have to memorize. Nevertheless, if you wanted to access it any time, you had to understand every single event clearly. A while later, our protagonist fell asleep, and afterward, Temiran appeared where he was. The butler then took the book our protagonist was reading while sighing and saying that it was dull to hold that book for a whole moon cycle. The man then wondered if our protagonist was thinking that he could be successful by studying. However, in the end, it was a relief. If Chiron was digging into practical books, the butler would have banned him from entering outside of work hours, but since that was not the case, he could let him go. After all, he was just an idiot who dreamed big. Let's hope for a 2-year time skip at the beginning of the next chapter. While working at the Ojent family's library, 3 months passed in the blink of an eye. Okay, it was not a 2-year time skip, but at least we got one. Then, one day, at work, a butler asked our protagonist if some books had been sorted out that day, to which the young boy replied that they were, before adding that the man could take 4 stacks that were nearby. By then, Sharon had gotten used to the sorting work, and it had gotten easier. Moreover, he had learned several facts from the butlers. The butler then took a book and told our protagonist that he would be borrowing it, to which Sharon replied by asking if the second young master would be borrowing that book again. However, right after, the young boy checked a document and said that the second young master hadn't returned the books he had borrowed last time, before adding that it would be a problem if they went missing. After hearing that, the butler began to scratch his head, looking embarrassed, before saying that he had been thinking that too, before adding that he kept asking him about them, but the second young master said that he would deal with it himself. Then, the butler said that the higher-ups wouldn't worry about books going missing. After all, the ones who would get in trouble were the butlers. The most shocking thing, in our protagonist's opinion, was that the nobles didn't pay much attention to the books in the library. Of course, he was also aware that the really important books were not in the library. However, that didn't make it any safer for him. The butler then began to walk away while asking our protagonist to keep that conversation a secret, before telling him to keep up the good work. By that point, Sharon had also realized that the carefreeness of the nobles was only possible because of the loyalty of the commoners. In fact, commoners put their lives on the line for things that the nobles would not even remember. Furthermore, nobles would do whatever was necessary to ensure that there were no mistakes. So, Sharon concluded that it was best to just mind your own business quietly. Suddenly, another young guy entered the place running while cursing some old guy, which surprised our protagonist. The newcomer then rhetorically asked if it was too much to ask for a rest on a day like that. At that moment, Sharon had already recognized the young boy as Rian Ogent, the youngest child of the noble family. At that moment, another person yelled nearby, scolding Rian for running away. In fact, apparently, his punishment would be 100 additional laps around the garden. After hearing that, the noble guy arrived at our protagonist's desk and told him that he couldn't tell anyone that he was there. Right after, Ryan hid under a shelf, and almost immediately, an old man with a long beard entered the place, yelling that he knew that Ryan was hiding there. The old man then took notice of our protagonist and asked him if he had seen a tiny blue-haired boy, which made our protagonist feel bad since Ryan was way taller than him. Sharon then replied that he believed that the old man was talking about the youngest young master before politely asking the newcomer who he was. The old man got annoyed after hearing the question, but he still replied that he was the sword master who could beat the hell out of that tiny rascal. Then, he warned Sharon by telling him that it would be best for him to stop messing with the old man and tell him where the youngest young master was if our protagonist didn't want to be the first one to get a beating. After hearing that, Sharon didn't think twice and sold Ryan with a gift bow included. Obviously, the youngest young master didn't like that and threatened our protagonist, but before he could say anything else, the old man grabbed him by the collar, which made Rian beg for mercy by saying that everything had been a misunderstanding. However, the sword master ignored the blue-haired boy's pleas and dragged the youngest young master away, while telling him that they were going to skip the training, because the old man was going to beat some sense into the boy, who threatened Sharon again while being dragged away. As for our protagonist, he thought that the teacher held the power of the noble family, so he had no choice. According to the rumors, Ryan was dragged into the mountains by his teacher and did not return until the following month. Now, regarding our protagonist, it took him 20 days to read the first book. However, after he completely understood its content, he read a whopping 82 history books. In the end, it was just as expected. The beginning was always the hardest part, and no book was completely different from another. Furthermore, since he had read about 200 of them, the remaining 650 books should be easier. Besides, while reading history books, he had a suspicion and began to wonder if studying history at that moment was really the right choice. Nevertheless, when he studied the accomplishments of past magicians, Sharon became certain that he had made the right choice. If scholars studied theories, then magicians were those people who brought those theories to reality. Magicians were like scholars, but despite that, the reason that not all scholars were magicians was due to the latter's extremely sensitive state of mind. They could not enter the spirit zone. With that in mind, our protagonist concluded that if he used a large amount of information as the foundation of information in his spirit zone, then he might be able to become a real magician. At that moment, our protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by Rian, who stormed in while yelling that he had endured hell just waiting for that day. After hearing that, our protagonist thought that the youngest young master was sure persistent. Right after, Sharon asked Rian if he had really gone there because of that, and the other quickly confirmed it. Ryan then asked Sharon if he knew how much he had suffered before adding that he had climbed up and down cliffs countless times. Each time the strength in his hands ran out, and he had thought he was going to die, he endured it with only revenge on his mind. At that moment, our protagonist thought that things were worse than he had thought because Ryan's rage had maxed out. Then, Ryan yelled at Sharon, asking him if he was not going to answer, and if he thought that he was like that just because he had suffered a bit. Back then, he had made a request of him, and he had believed in him. However, our protagonist had sold him, and when Ryan saw cowards like him, he got furious. Ryan then grabbed our protagonist by the collar, and Sharon quickly replied that he had not sold him but said the truth to the old man. Sadly, the youngest young master didn't buy that explanation, because if our protagonist was planning to do that, he should have refused his request when he asked it of him. After hearing that, our protagonist thought that people with power always used logic in their favor. Sharon then asked Ryan what he could do to make it better. Those words caught Ryan by surprise, and the noble boy immediately thought that Sharon was obviously a lowly butler who had just started working there. Still, he didn't understand why he was showing a calm demeanor. Ryan then smiled creepily while saying that he had finally understood that our protagonist was looking down on him, before adding that he was going to show him what kind of person he was. He then ordered our protagonist to follow him, and Sharon complied. Shortly after, they arrived at the training grounds, and our protagonist wondered if Ryan was truly planning on beating him up until his anger subsided. Still, Sharon steeled himself, thinking that he would just take whatever punches Ryan threw at him, since it was better than dying. Moreover, he couldn't throw away the opportunity that his parents had risked their lives to get for him. Right after, the youngest young master interrupted our protagonist's thoughts by throwing a wooden sword at him, before adding that they were going to have a duel. Ryan then explained that he was not a coward like our protagonist, and that he would one day become the greatest swordsman in the world, before adding that he would make Sharon pay the price for looking down on him with his sword. That shocked Sharon, who quickly asked the other if he was that cowardly, before adding that, as a bubbler of the Ogent family, he needed to defend the Ogent family. However, Ryan quickly cut him off by saying that our protagonist had sold him because he didn't want to be beaten by the teacher. After all, Sharon had neglected a person who was in a difficult spot. At that moment, Sharon noticed that the look in Ryan's eyes had changed, and almost immediately, the youngest young master said that even though he might be looked down upon by her family, he would not allow himself to be scorned by the likes of our protagonist. Right after, Ryan added that, considering the difference in their ability, he would let Sharon strike him 3 times first. Sharon then noticed the look in Ryan's eyes and realized that he was definitely an Ogent. He also thought that the wooden sword was hard and that if he so much as broke a bone, he would be sent home. At that moment, he was desperately wondering what he should do. Suddenly, he had an enlightenment moment and found the solution to his predicament. In fact, he immediately resolved to do it since he had 3 chances. Immediately thereafter, he launched his first attack, but it was easily blocked by Ryan. Moreover, even with just blocking, Sharon could feel the youngest young master's strength through the way his wooden sword trembled in his hands after being blocked. Still, our protagonist attacked again, but again his attack was easily blocked. In fact, at that moment, Ryan smirked and reminded Sharon that he had spent 2 of his 3 tickets before asking our protagonist if he had even held a sword before. On the other hand, Sharon was clenching his teeth, thinking that he only had 1 more chance. At that moment, Sharon entered the spirit zone and changed his stance into a weird one. Ryan noticed the change and asked our protagonist what was with that stance, before adding that it would be very hard for him not to block the incoming attack. And the youngest young master was right. He easily blocked the 3rd attack and said that it was his turn to attack, but he didn't notice that his wooden sword had cracked after receiving that 3rd impact, and almost immediately his sword broke in pieces, which caught Ryan by surprise. After seeing the result, our protagonist thought that his gamble had worked. He had sensed it with the 1st attack and calculated the timing of his opponent with the 2nd attack, and he did it on the 3rd attack, the thunder strike that he had practiced for 3 years. At that moment, Ryan interrupted Sharon's thoughts by asking him where he had learned his swordsmanship, to which our protagonist replied that it was not swordsmanship, but a thunder strike, which shocked the youngest young master. Sharon then explained that his father worked in the mountains, and he also followed his father's footsteps and cut down trees in the mountains. However, since his physique was too weak to cut down trees, he had learned that technique to compensate for it. Our protagonist then added that the technique in question was called thunder strike. Among the lumberjacks, unbeknownst to Sharon, his words deeply shocked Ryan because the youngest young master thought that it was absurd that the butler had mastered a technique while cutting down trees. After all, Ryan had held a sword in his hands for 15 years, and he believed that there was no way that thunder strike was a technique that could be learned just by cutting some firewood. Ryan then recalled a moment when Rai used sword slaughter to destroy his sword during a duel, which earned him praise because it was amazing that Rai had learned that technique. After all, he was only 12 years old and already knew how to use Ojent's secret technique. In fact, Rai's instructor by that time told him that he had nothing more to teach him as he was already far more advanced than his peers. Right after, someone who seemed to be Rai's father told him that he should have inherited his genius before informing him that they should celebrate his achievement by having a grand banquet. As for Rian, he was sitting on the floor, his eyes teary and his frustration mounting, wondering why he couldn't catch up to Rai. Back to the present, Chiron was beginning to feel nervous since Ryan's expression didn't look good, and his fear was confirmed when, in the following moment, the youngest young master snapped and yelled that he wouldn't acknowledge it. Right after, our protagonist asked Rian if he had offended him, but the youngest young master yelled Chiron to shut up before grabbing his sword and throwing it, sheathed, to the butler. Rian then said that since both their weapons had been destroyed, the match was not over yet. Oh, this is taking being a sore loser to the next level. Moreover, the youngest young master, who looked furious, said that if our protagonist had already mastered sword slaughter, then she should treat him accordingly. So basically, he's going to kill Chiron. This guy is insane. However, Rian gave Chiron some leeway by telling him that 1 month later, they would be fighting in that place with real swords. Those words scared our protagonist because, by doing that, he might really die. Almost immediately, Chiron asked Rian to reconsider it, since he had never learned swordsmanship before in his life. Nevertheless, the youngest young master simply replied that he was giving him time precisely because of that. After all, if Chiron was someone who was capable enough to master sword slaughter by cutting trees, he would be able to make it somehow. Rian also warned our protagonist against running away because he would definitely surpass him. Afterward, Chiron was sitting on his desk while grabbing his face with his hands, thinking that he understood what was happening. The Ojent family was said to have black and blue hair in the family. The patriarch, Bishop Ojent Black Hair, bore 3 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest son, black-haired, was an official 6th-class swordsman, while the eldest daughter, Blue Hair, also had exceptional talent. She chose music over the sword and was currently a pianist in the palace. Moreover, the second son, Ojent to Black-haired, was also a genius. On the other hand, Ryan was different from his exceptional siblings. He was quite untalented, even though he had an exclusive instructor, and anyone in the family knew it. It was then that our protagonist admitted that he had done something unnecessary. In fact, he told himself that he should have just let Ryan hit him. Unfortunately, he had hurt the pride of someone who had always been compared to his siblings. Moreover, the nobles always thought that they were above everyone. Chiron had thought that he wouldn't die unless it was some book question, but if he died, then his parents were going to suffer. Besides, he didn't have time to be like that since he was going to become a mage. Since he lived in the mountains, he was confident in his stamina. So, if he learned how to defend, he might be able to survive. With that in mind, he began to pick up all the books he could find about swordsmanship. After all, he needed to do everything that he could. On the other hand, Ryan was fully committed to his training, even completing the laps faster than the record, which pleased his master. In fact, the old man asked the youngest young master what was happening, because he couldn't believe Rian was training so obediently. However, the young guy ignored those words and complained by doubting the quality of his training, which astonished the sword master. And when the old man asked him what he was saying, Rian explained that he was still standing on his 2 feet. Before asking the old man if he had something worse than that, those words leave the old man thinking, and he asked Rian what had happened to him, to which the youngest young master replied that nothing had happened. However, the swordmaster didn't buy it and began to wonder if Rai had achieved some new technique again. After all, that boy had already unlocked schema. Still, the old man decided to indulge Rian and told him that he shouldn't blame him if he died. Schema was a virtual body, a schematic diagram of the human body. While mages had the spirit zone, swordsmen had schema. All humans have an image of their own physical body, but schema was able to manifest that to the extreme. Thanks to it, a master in schema was able to perfectly control and use every single cell in their body. While Chiron was reading some books about schema, he quickly realized that it was the total opposite of the spirit zone, and he began to wonder if he should give it a try. He then began to feel himself, since that was the first step. For him, that was easy at that point, since it was the same as the spirit zone. While for the spirit zone, he erased his own self for schema. He needed to dig into his own existence. Then, once he took away that black veil, it would be the completion of schema's first page. However, it would be inefficient to pour all his efforts into schema, which was the total opposite of the spirit zone at that moment. It was then that he began to wonder if the girl he met 3 years prior was a schema user. He also thought that she was amazing for reaching such a high level at that young age. Afterward, he took the sword and began to practice while thinking that it would be better if he learned a few swordsmanship skills with the spirit zone as the base. He then decided to start with the 8 directions of slashing first. On the other hand, Ryan was pushing his body to its limit, and his master began to warn him against it, telling him that his muscles would burst at that rate. However, the youngest young master replied that his muscles hadn't burst yet. In fact, he began to curse, complaining because his muscles were not bursting, and his arms were not getting broken. In the end, he yelled, asking why he could learn schema. Suddenly, the swordmaster grabbed Ryan's sword and told the boy that it was enough before adding that they should call it a day. It was then that Ryan finally complied. The old man then began to attend to the boy's injuries while asking him what he was thinking, to which the other replied that he was thinking that his arms hurt like hell. Suddenly, the old man said that he had never written the youngest young master as being talented in his report before, which the boy didn't like. In fact, he quickly replied that because of that, he was working so hard. Right after, the old man added that he believed that Ryan had done great and asked the boy if he had thought of what he had done well before, to which the other replied that he didn't know, before adding that he only knew what he didn't do well. After hearing that, the swordmaster replied that what he had just said was the reason he was not a genius. Ryan then pouted and asked his master to stop saying that already, since he knew it very well. Nevertheless, the old man ignored his pupil's plea and said that geniuses knew that they were geniuses and what they did well, which was why the efforts that geniuses put in were just actions that they did with 100% confidence that they did well. In the end, the thing that those geniuses were really scared of was hard work aimed at obtaining what couldn't be obtained. A burning will that challenged things that couldn't be done. That was what the natural enemy of geniuses was. Shortly after, Ryan replied that among all the comforting words he had heard so far, he liked those the best. The boy then thought that if talent was something that he couldn't get from the start, he would just grit his teeth and work for it. Then, he told himself that he would win for sure. Oh, things are getting interesting. Looking forward to that duel. Back with our protagonist, he was still practicing, asking himself what swordsmanship was, before thinking that it was the entire mechanics behind the exercise intending to end a life. Inside it, however, there was psychology deeply embedded in determining life and death. Seijiro Hiko, is that you? Sharon then decided to try to imagine an opponent. He then told himself that the opponent might try to attack him with all sorts of methods, but in reality, there were only 8 directions the attack might come from. So, he trained to slash in 8 different directions for a month, and block in 8 different directions as well. Just those 2 things. A while later, he finished his training and said that he believed that swordsmen had chosen that path. After all, the realm of the sword was as infinite as magic. Right after, he sheathed the sword while apologizing to his parents because he didn't know if he would be able to return. However, he had no regrets. Even if he might be at a crossroads of life and death, he had seen such a wondrous world. Finally, the day of the duel arrived, and that night Ryan and Sharon met at the arena. At that moment, Ryan noticed something and thought that in just 1 month, our protagonist could already emit a powerful aura. It was then that he realized that the boy in front of him might not have learned swordsmanship back then. However, the boy who was currently in front of him was showing a calm expression while holding a real sword. In fact, Ryan began to wonder if Sharon really possessed the same talent as Rai, and right after, he told himself that he should defeat him all the more. Almost immediately, the duel began and Ryan launched toward our protagonist, who was amazed by the youngest young master's incredible swordsmanship. Ryan truly was on a completely different level from him. But Sharon could feel it. He could feel Ryan's sword path. Right after, our protagonist dodged his opponent's attack, and Ryan was shocked after noticing that the butler was staring at his blade. At that moment, the noble boy wondered if his opponent was afraid of it at all. On the other hand, Sharon thought that even though he couldn't overcome the fear of death by himself, the root of the fear of death was in the future, and the future was just an illusion that didn't exist yet. After all, if they did not imagine the next moment, any human could leap off a cliff. Back with Ryan, he thought that what Sharon was showing was not just determination against death. In fact, the noble boy believed that his opponent had blocked off his emotions completely. However, he also didn't fear death. Ryan attacked again, but our protagonist blocked it, and they began to exchange blows, while the noble boy thought that even if you struggled, there was always a wall you couldn't bypass with cheap tricks. In the meantime, Sharon thought that Ryan's blade was quite heavy, yet swift. Besides, it was getting harder to sense his attacks with synesthesia. Right after, our protagonist received a wound on his chest, which shocked him because it made him realize that he was going to be killed. Almost immediately, Ryan launched an attack trying to deal a devastating blow, but our protagonist managed to dodge it at the last second. Moreover, he moved away to create some distance while thinking that something was strange and wondering how that was possible. On the other hand, after his following attack was barely blocked by Sharon, Ryan smiled confidently, thinking that his opponent looked dumbfounded and wondering if our protagonist had finally realized it. The noble boy was using the Ojent swordsmanship intended for training with a big sword, so there was no way the butler could withstand his blade. As for Chiron, he was touching the wound on his chest, thinking that every strike contained enough force to crush his bones. Right after, Ryan launched toward Chiron, thinking that he would crush our protagonist with his strength. Nevertheless, after blocking that attack, the butler thought that something was not adding up. After all, if Ryan had slashed upwards after striking his chest, he could have severed his side, and it would have been over. In the end, our protagonist couldn't understand why his opponent was only using big movements to attack. Then, it hit Chiron, and our protagonist realized that his opponent had a lesser understanding of the sword than he thought. There is some plot in your plot armor. Simon, author Xan, are you truly asking me to believe that the protagonist became an expert just by reading books for 1 month? Yes, he also practiced slashes, but still. In Chiron's opinion, even though Ryan might be good at using skills, he lacked the insight to apply them. Thus, our protagonist decided to lower the noble boy's expected battle abilities from that moment onward. In fact, he made a change of plans and decided to take the initiative and attack. Of course, that change surprised Ryan, who couldn't believe that his opponent had attacked him. After all, he thought that Chiron was running out of strength. Furthermore, Ryan found it annoying that it was very hard to block him despite the fact that the butler was only using basic slashes. Back with our protagonist, he thought that the noble boy's physical strength had dropped significantly and concluded that he needed to maintain the rhythm so that he wouldn't waste his strength. On the other hand, Ryan couldn't believe what was happening because he had completely lost the upper hand. In fact, he began to recall that moment when Rai had defeated him by crushing his wooden sword, especially the mocking smile that his older brother had dedicated to him at the end. Right after, the noble boy yelled, telling our protagonist to stop making him laugh, before adding that he would become the greatest swordsman in the world. Immediately thereafter, Ryan launched toward Chiron, but our protagonist managed to block the attack. At that moment, the butler wondered if Ryan had given up on winning, considering how he was using brute force. In fact, he began to wonder if Ryan was even thinking. However, at that very moment, our protagonist noticed something. The noble boy's sword path was no longer visible. It had become unpredictable, which was a problem, especially because almost immediately, Ryan launched another attack. Chiron was not able to read the sword path because there were too many of them. Still, he did his best to block the incoming attack. Then the swords collided, and one of them ended up flying away. Right after, both guys looked at each other briefly before Ryan lowered his head, while wondering if something like that was possible. The noble boy then recalled that at the last moment, our protagonist changed his grip and struck upwards. Ryan then wondered what kind of guy the butler was. On the other hand, Chiron thought that he didn't know that he would actually win. The problem was what was going to happen afterward. After all, even if it was a match, he was against a noble, and that person's pride had been stained. Chiron then wondered what Ryan would do to blame it on him. Still, he kept pointing his sword at the noble boy's chest. Luckily, shortly after, Ryan admitted his defeat. He did it politely at first, but shortly after, he began to curse. Nevertheless, Ryan told our protagonist that, since he had lost, he had nothing to say even if our protagonist killed him. Well, let me assume that your parents think otherwise. After hearing that, the butler asked Ryan if he was joking, which confused the other. Chiron then explained that if he killed him, he wouldn't be able to live, so he asked Ryan to stop speaking nonsense. The noble boy then smiled and said that they had both fought, risking their lives, and he had admitted defeat. There was no referee, and the only witness would be too dead to talk, so it is natural that Chiron believed that the other was talking nonsense. That was too much for Chiron, who snapped after hearing that. Our protagonist then yelled at the noble boy, saying that the absurd duel didn't even make sense, because Ryan was blaming our protagonist, trying to avoid admitting that he was hiding because he didn't want to train. Then, it was Ryan's turn to snap, and he yelled at our protagonist, asking who was blaming whom, before adding that Chiron's actions were asking for it. After all, even if they had met for the first time, the butler should have kept his loyalty in a situation like that. However, Chiron wasn't having any of that and cursed at the loyalty Ryan was demanding, which of course pissed the noble boy. Nevertheless, our protagonist didn't back down and asked Ryan if he had ever thought of the pressure he felt from undergoing a swordsmanship match with the son of the family head. Then, Chiron added that if the youngest young master had loyalty, he wouldn't put pressure like that on a butler. He even told Ryan that standing in front of the sword instructor should be both loyal and cool. Right after, our protagonist dropped to the ground while yelling that he almost died, and that behavior confused Ryan since he believed that people usually complimented each other after a fight. Moreover, the noble boy wondered what had happened to the cold warrior who was fighting him a few minutes prior. At that moment, Ryan thought our protagonist was a genius, but unlike Rai, Chiron was not laughing at him. Instead, the butler had clashed with him with all his might. It was then that the noble boy finally asked for our protagonist's name. Okay, if author San wanted to convey how messed up nobles are in his world, mission accomplished, baby. Right after, they both introduced themselves, and Rian immediately offered his hand to help Sharon get up, saying they should be friends. Sometime later, at the butler's headquarters, Temiran was informed that there were 728 organized books out of 10,453. Right after, the butler turned around and told our protagonist that he had made good progress in a year. A year had passed since Sharon had started working at the Ogent Great Library. Besides, the fewer books there were, the more efficiency was multiplied. As for Sharon's own goal of the 850 history books, there were only 200 left. Sharon's reading capacity could handle over 3 books in a day, and the backbone of knowledge that he dreamed of would soon be complete. Outside of that, he had experienced swordsmanship and understood the nature of fear. Thanks to that, his spirit zone stamina also got better. Our protagonist then thought that he had believed that he was really dead back then, while recalling his battle against Ryan. However, in the end, even if the start was rough, if you don't give up, soon the finish line will be before your eyes. But more importantly than anything, any other benefits were not comparable to having a good friend. At that moment, Rian interrupted our protagonist's thoughts by saying that there were a lot of books, before wondering out loud if his family had read all of those books. Almost immediately, Sharon replied that they did, before adding that the family head and the 7th young master went there a lot. After hearing that, Ryan clicked his tongue while saying that it was nice to be smart. After getting close to the youngest young master, our protagonist discovered that, compared to his huge body, Ryan was caring and quite playful, which was fitting for the youngest son. In fact, Sharon truly believed that he fitted the youngest son title, especially after Ryan threw away the book he was holding, while saying that there were too many books to read. Almost immediately, our protagonist scolded the noble boy, telling him that if he damaged the books, the butler would die. However, Ryan quickly dismissed Sharon's worries by saying that there was no way a book was more valuable than a human's life. He even added that Sharon shouldn't worry, because even if our protagonist burned down the library, he would protect the butler. After hearing that, our protagonist thought that he couldn't hate Rian if he didn't talk. Right after, Sharon replied that he believed that he would be safe if the noble boy stayed still, before asking Rian why he was there today, and what about his training. Immediately thereafter, the noble boy replied that he had done only basic training, before adding that he wanted to study at the library. Those words angered our protagonist, who began to tremble, and Sharon told Rian that he should study before asking him what he was doing. However, the noble boy threw a tantrum, yelling that he was bored. However, our protagonist knew that Ryan was not a lazy person. The thing was that he was like fire, a fire that couldn't be controlled once it started burning. So, if a trigger happened, it burned bright again. 10 minutes later, they were both sitting at a desk, and Sharon told the noble boy that if he was there to study, he should study. Right after, Rian recalled that our protagonist had told him that he was studying to become a mage, before asking if there was a reason to read so many books. Sharon then explained that he was behind because he didn't have a chance to study before he got there, but after reading 600 history books, our protagonist knew most of it. After hearing that, Rian thought that it was fascinating every time he saw it. He was amazed by how fast our protagonist read. Moreover, he admitted that even though the butler was the same age as him, Sharon seemed so much more mature. Afterward, Rian took a book and started to read it while saying that it looked interesting. In the book, the author said that he was sure the reader had wondered who would come out on top if a swordsman and a mage clashed. The author then explained that he had traveled the world in search of that answer. In fact, even by the moment he was writing the book, when he closed his eyes, he saw the Artista Mountains that were 6,000 meters above sea level. At that moment, Ryan stopped reading and said that the book was disgustingly boring. That angered Sharon, who quickly retorted, saying that the book was fun to him. Almost immediately, the noble boy asked what was so fun about the book. After all, there were no pictures, and there was nothing about swordsmanship. Nevertheless, Sharon asked Rian how he could even say that after reading a single page, before asking the noble boy who would win, to which Rian replied by asking why the heck would a mage and a swordsman fight. Right after, Rai appeared and replied that the swordsman undoubtedly would win, which shocked the pair. Immediately thereafter, Sharon stood up, bowed, and greeted the Sen young master while Rian asked Rai how he knew it. Meanwhile, our protagonist wondered if Rai had listened to their conversation. After all, if a butler and a noble were caught having a normal conversation, it would never end lightly. Of course, Ryan wasn't considering any of that and asked Rai, while smirking, how he could be so sure, before adding that he was siding with the swordsman because he was one. Rai then replied by saying that there was no need to use an expression like that, before explaining that you could know by looking at the location of the swordsman and mage on the land. After hearing that, Ryan scoffed before saying that they were talking about them fighting, so location didn't matter. He even asked Rai if he was going to sprout nonsense like the badge of rank on the battlefield. However, Rai simply ignored his brother and asked Sharon what he thought about it, which annoyed Rian. As for our protagonist, he wondered if there was a hidden intent behind that question. Sharon always thought that Rai was a hard man to read, and that was even harder to know in that situation. Our protagonist then began to wonder if he should give a proper response or not. Shortly after, Chiron replied that if the swordsman and the mage were at similar skill levels, he believed that as soon as the swordsman stepped into the range of a mage, it would be hard for the swordsman to win. Nevertheless, if the swordsman used their superior physical capabilities to attack before the mage could use magic, they could win. At that point, Rai interrupted our protagonist by telling him that he was wrong, before adding that the mage would lose. After hearing that, Rian got pissed while thinking that his attitude was typical of his brother. From a young age, when he saw something he didn't like, he enjoyed crushing what was precious to them. Right after, Rai said that it looked like Chiron enjoyed history, before adding that he was sure that he had heard about the 5 godly generals' armor, the artifact that disturbed the mage's spirit zone, which was called anti-magic. The spirit zone was a mage's exclusive ability. So fighting a mage in that domain was similar to going against sharks that were freely circling you in deep water. However, taking away the shark's senses by disrupting the water was the essence of OT magic. If you couldn't go into the spirit zone, then you also couldn't touch magic. So, if you were equipped with such an artifact, no mage would be able to attack you. Nevertheless, up to a certain extent, it was just theory. First, arty magic was an amazing ancient technique that was made from the magic flowing from a dragon's heart. On top of that, it had the nature of the waves, so no matter how much money was spent, its efficiency did not increase even in the slightest. Even Yakra, the master of the waves equation, could only increase the 5 godly generals' armor set's efficiency to 65%. Because of that, the price was huge. Right after, Rai said that he was aware that the price was astronomical, since one part was around 1 year's worth of the kingdom's budget. After hearing that, Ryan asked what that was, and if a swordsman was then stronger. Then, Rai said that the problem was that the one who had made the magic was a mage. That shocked Rian and Sharon. In fact, the former immediately asked why a mage would do that, to which Rai replied that it was obvious, since many places needed anti-magic. So, it was the best way to sit on a throne of money. Those kinds of mages were lining up for themselves to be used, so there was no need to buy those ancient artifacts. Right after, Rai added that, in case the pair didn't understand, mages were a pathetic class that sold their own kind's weakness for money, and Rian replied that Rai was being too harsh. Right after, Sharon intervened, saying that mages were like that, which shocked the siblings. In fact, that was the first time Rai changed his expression. Our protagonist then explained that, just like Rai had said, anti-magic was made by a mage. Additionally, it was used in places where magic was forbidden to restrict magical activity, and it was used appropriately as a training aid for the magic school too. Thanks to that, not only was anti-magic disadvantageous to mages, but it was also a fruit of the world that was used to reap the benefits of the world. So, in the end, our protagonist believed that it was hard to think that swordsmen were above mages because of that reason, which of course, angered Rai and pleased Rian. Almost immediately, Rai yelled at our protagonist that idealism and reality were two different things, before adding that what Sharon had said didn't matter, because the fact that a mage couldn't win against a swordsman wouldn't change. Right after, the second young master left the place. Pathetic. So-called genius, his reaction was dreadful. Once Rai left, Sharon sighed, smiled, and said that he believed that he was going to die. Almost immediately, Ryan put his arm around our protagonist's shoulder while laughing out loud, before saying that the butler was the best, and that it was the first time he had seen his brother with that expression. The noble boy then added that our protagonist's tongue was a sword, and that he was going to be the best swordsman in the world. Finally, Rian admitted that he felt very refreshed. On the other hand, Sharon thought that, as Rai had said, he was not sure if idealism and reality were different. However, regarding the research mentality where you could put your own weakness into experiments without hesitation, he wondered if that cold intellect existed in the world. 6 months later, Temiran was reading a report while drinking tea, when he said that it had ended faster than he had anticipated. Right after, the butler who had served the tea to Temiran said that it was great that the library transfer had been pushed forward 6 months, but categorizing the books that had been neglected for 20 years was a tough job. Right after, the butler added that it was a shame to send away such a useful child, before adding that if they extended the contract by making up some sort of excuse, then it would also be a little easier for them. However, after hearing that, Temiran replied that the other was saying something unlike him, before ordering him to leave and do his work. Right after, the other complied, and when he left, Temiran kept drinking his tea while reflecting on our protagonist. Meanwhile, our protagonist finished reading a book, and thought that even though reading a book was easy, Going through many books with several hundred pages was something else. He then thought that everything was like a dream. Nevertheless, his thoughts were interrupted by Rian, who stormed in yelling. He asked if our protagonist had finished all his work and if Sharon hadn't gone home yet. Right after, he met with the butler and asked him if he had truly finished, and the other confirmed it with a smile, before adding that there was nothing left to read, at least not there. After hearing that, the noble boy hugged him and praised him, saying that he was an amazing guy. Ryan then congratulated Chiron, and our protagonist asked him if he could go to his house before he left. That stunned Ryan a lot, and Chiron asked him if that was really something to be surprised about, to which the noble boy replied that our protagonist had hidden their relationship thoroughly. Are they having an affair, or was it just a poor choice of words? Right after, Ryan, who had teary eyes, said that he was quite upset about it, which was why he wasn't expecting Sharon to say something like that. Our protagonist then thought that, in all honesty, it was kind of regretful for him. The place they usually met was the library, and there was never enough time for themselves. So, since they had lived like that for a year, he wanted to see how his friend was living before he left. Almost immediately, Rian told him that they should go right away since all of his family members were out. Sometime later, they were both inside Ryan's house, and our protagonist couldn't help but be amazed. He then thought that it was a little scary to be there. In fact, he asked Rian if he could really enter through the front door, to which the other replied that our protagonist should not worry, because everybody should be returning in the evening. Sharon then said that it was really quiet, to which the other replied that there were only servants. Once inside, our protagonist saw a door and wondered if that huge door was the entrance to a room, and if one room there was larger than his entire house. It was then that Sharon truly understood that Ryan was really the young master of a wealthy family. Ryan's room was the smallest room at the end of the hallway, and once they stepped inside, our protagonist asked Rian if that was a training room, since there were several swords placed everywhere. In fact, the butler thought that it was like a lodge that you temporarily stayed at after training, and that Ryan lived in a place like that. A while later, the noble boy was cursing because our protagonist had beaten him again while playing cards. He then asked Sharon if he was using the spirit zone to scam him, and our protagonist immediately denied it. Our protagonist then explained that when Rian got an ace, he had a habit of putting the card on the outside, and the time it took for him to bet when you had a pair and when he didn't was different too. Those little things made everything obvious to the butler. After hearing that, a flustered Rian asked Chiron how he had found out about those things, and Chiron replied that being observant when you were being obsessive gave you great results. Our protagonist then added that it was not just looking at your opponent's small details, but also looking at them as a whole. Then, you could get a sense of that person's intentions. Right after, Ryan repeated Sharon's words, trying to understand them, until his brain began to fry from the sheer effort. In the end, he asked our protagonist if using a schema could help, to which the butler replied that it might because when he went into the spirit zone it helped. At that moment, Sharon grabbed a book and asked Rian if he could borrow it, before adding that he had only read history books and hadn't read a novel in a while. However, the noble boy couldn't reply because he had passed out after frying his brain trying to understand Sharon's words. This guy is the definition of a muscle brain, so we shouldn't be surprised by this. Right after, Sharon checked his pocket watch while saying that Rian had told him that his family members would be back in the evening. You shouldn't take any chances. Just leave. Don't make a mistake on your last day at work. At that moment, he could hear the sound of a piano and immediately thought that there was only one person in that estate who could play the piano, Ryan's older sister, who was also the court pianist, Raina Ogent. Our protagonist got closer and began to listen to the performance, hidden behind a wall, but the lady quickly discovered it, and once she finished playing, she asked him how her piano sonata had been, which shocked him because he had been caught by her. This might be the fastest IQ drop in the West. Still, he quickly regained his composure and managed to reply that it had been great while thinking about what he should do. Ryan then told him that it was her first time seeing him, before asking if he was new. He then replied that he was, before explaining that he had been entrusted with categorizing the books. He also added that he had been doing it for a year. After hearing that, she seemed to recognize him, and said that not just anyone could categorize books, which meant that he should be quite intelligent. Right after, she asked him if he had played the piano before, and he replied that he had never played it. Sharon then thought that he couldn't let his guard down, because she was a skilled person who used schema to play the piano. Not to mention that Ryan had told him that she was the most awful person in the estate, and he goes and tries to listen to her performance in secret. This kid is a genius. After a pause, she told him that he would teach him and asked him if he wanted to take a seat beside her, which totally stunned him. He just couldn't believe that she had asked him to do that. After seeing his reaction, she told him that it was okay, and added that no one would punish him since he had allowed it. I would need at least 3 witnesses and a notarized contract to trust that statement. After hearing that, Shiron thought that since she was saying it so nicely, there was no way he could reject that offer. Moreover, he had no idea of when he would ever sit in front of a piano again. Immediately thereafter, she began to teach him the keys on the piano and the symbols on the music score. Then, she explained how to play chords by pressing various keys at the same time, and he couldn't help but think that it sounded great. Shortly after, he asked her if he could try playing it once, and she quickly replied that she could go ahead. He then said that it might not sound nice, and she told him that it was normal since he was playing it for the first time, before thinking that he had just learned a few chords that day. Sharon then began to play the piano, and she immediately noticed that he was doing it wrong. However, she also noticed that he didn't hesitate to press the keys. At that moment, she wondered if she should stop him, but right after, she thought that it was strange. Even though it was completely wrong, it was perfectly the same, and that realization shocked her. It felt like he was playing what she had played earlier. Unbeknownst to her, our protagonist had entered the spirit zone while he was playing. Nevertheless, she realized that the sound was getting more and more accurate, and she just couldn't believe it. She then began to wonder what she was witnessing, because it couldn't really be called a performance. However, it seemed to have seen through the essence of the performance. At that moment, she was not able to understand why someone like him was working as a butler, not to mention that he looked pretty elegant too. Right after, he finished playing and quickly apologized to her for his performance, but before she could reply, someone yelled that it was extremely noisy. Moreover, that person called Rina a devilish old granny. The person in question was Rian, and the noble guy quickly got closer while saying that she should just clean up and go to sleep upon arriving home, instead of acting like some crazy woman. Of course, Shiron felt that he had been caught red-handed having an affair, and he quickly asked Ryan why he was there before adding that he could explain everything. On the other hand, Reina looked confused, and she asked if our protagonist and her brother knew each other, which caught Shiron off guard. Still, he managed to reply that they didn't know each other, while thinking that his relationship with Ryan would get exposed at that rate. Our protagonist's thoughts were proven right almost immediately, because Rian quickly admitted that they were friends. That astonished Shiron, who immediately tried to reverse the situation by asking Rian what he was talking about, but the noble boy simply laughed and told our protagonist that she shouldn't worry. Ryan then added that even though the devilish old granny had a nasty personality, she didn't care about things like that. Still, Shiron couldn't believe it, and he even thought that Ryan was being crazy just by saying it. At that moment, Rina asked the butler if his name was Shiron, and almost immediately, she patted our protagonist's shoulder while smiling at him and saying that he should worry because if Ryan said that he was his friend, then he was. And she took the chance to show why Rian considered her a nasty person, because she added that even though her brother was pretty pathetic, he was someone who meant what he said. Almost immediately, she changed the subject and asked Shiron what he was thinking while playing the piano, since she was really curious about it. Those words shocked Rian because he didn't know that the one playing the piano was our protagonist. In fact, he told the butler that he had thought Shiron was just acting crazy. Meanwhile, our protagonist was thinking that the wall of common sense that was built for 16 years was just being torn apart by those two siblings. He just couldn't believe that she didn't care about her brother being friends with a commoner. Immediately thereafter, he asked Rian why he had lied to him, since his sister was such a good and kind person. Those words shocked Rian, and he immediately warned our protagonist against being taken by her. He then added that Reina was a witch who would devour him if he lowered his guard. Luckily, Reina didn't take it to heart and even apologized to Shiron because her brother was just kinda immature, before adding that she was glad that he had a friend like our protagonist. Obviously, the butler quickly replied that he was the one who was thankful for all of that. After hearing that, she began to praise Shiron for being a cutie, and Ryan didn't miss the chance to tease Reina by telling her that she should live with him if he was that cute. He even added that she might as well make him part of their family. Nevertheless, she didn't take the bait and asked Rian if he was close enough with Shiron for him to give his sister's hand to him. As for Rian, he didn't take the bait either and replied by asking her what she was talking about, before adding that he didn't care about her and that Shiron deserved better. However, before he could finish that last sentence, she grabbed him by the collar, threw him to the floor, climbed over him, and began to hit him while asking him if he had dared to climb above her head just because she was nice to him. Then, while Rian was being beaten by his sister, our protagonist watched the scene silently, thinking that he really didn't understand nobles. A while later, Rian asked Rina why she had returned, since she was on vacation. She then replied that Rai was taking the official swordsman qualification exam, and she had returned to fetch him and depart for the exam the following day. She also added that their grandfather would arrive later because he was meeting a friend at that moment. Those words shocked Rian, and he began to sulk while mumbling that things had already gone very far. If you passed the swordsman qualification exam, you received an official qualification certificate, which was the standard and hierarchy that was recognized not just by the kingdom, but by the whole continent. While the exam only took place once a year and more than 1,000 people would attend, only around 30 people would be able to get the official qualification certification. Of course, there were also unofficial qualification certifications. If one graduated from the Alpia's Magic Academy, a special organization that had been approved by the royal family, they could become an unofficial 10th class mage. Moreover, they could also increase their class if they obtained achievement points through the association or the guild. Nevertheless, it was natural that people gathered where money and fame were. So, even if there were unofficial qualifications, there were still endless people who tried for the official exam, and Rai was going to take such an incredible exam at the young age of 18. Rian then sighed and said that geniuses such were different and got tons of support from the family. Right after, Raina patted her brother's head while telling him to cheer up, before adding that she needed to go prepare for that night's dinner. After all, since there was seafood from the palace, she needed to prepare it personally. She then began to take her leave and told Chiron that it had been nice meeting him, before adding that they should exchange greetings the next time they met again. He immediately agreed, while wondering if they would really meet again. In fact, he began to imagine playing the piano again with her. However, he was aware that he would be leaving the mansion the following day. Chiron then asked Rian if his sister had a boyfriend, which awakened the nasty side of the noble boy. Our protagonist noticed that and quickly said that it was not what the other was thinking, before adding that he had just asked for fun. In fact, he asked him to ignore that he had asked him that. Nevertheless, Ryan launched at full speed toward his sister while calling her, while our protagonist panicked and tried in vain to stop him. Chiron then thought that he had let his tongue slip because he felt sad that they wouldn't be able to meet again. Shortly after, Ryan yelled to his sister that our protagonist had asked him if she had a boyfriend. He was so loud that not only did she hear, but all the maids who were with her also listened. Of course, the maids were astonished, and it was then that our protagonist finally caught up with the noble boy. However, even though Chiron covered Ryan's mouth with his hand, the damage was already done. Obviously, the maids began to wonder out loud why someone wanted to know if Raina had a boyfriend, while an embarrassed Raina quickly told them not to mind the two boys because they were just kids fooling around. What if the secret to becoming the world's strongest mage wasn't noble blood, ancient talent, or a mountain of gold, but just reading 150 history books while accidentally chopping firewood in a mental void? Meet Chiron, a commoner kid who turns insight into a cheat code, accidentally befriends a noble meathead, survives execution for crossing class lines, and proves magic is basically advanced philosophy with extra steps. Welcome to Infinite Mage, where genius beats lineage, nobles get emotionally wrecked, and the real incantation is just I read the instructions. Chiron's library grind finally paid off. Ryan just drew steel on his own dad, and a grandpa just called their class a masterpiece. If you're wondering whether Chiron actually walks free, casts his first real spell, or accidentally rewrites the noble hierarchy, we're just getting started. If you guys want part 2, comment the word noble in the comments below and I'll drop it fast. Smash that like, subscribe for more, and remember, in this world, the real cheat code isn't bloodline, it's just reading ahead. Catch you in the next chapter! Was not interested, before asking the butler to tell her that she could do whatever she wanted. After hearing that, the butler replied that it was not it, before adding that the contract butler, known as Chiron, was in danger and might die, which completely shocked the youngest young master. Ryan couldn't believe what he had just heard, and said that Chiron was supposed to go back to his home that day. The butler then replied that the head butler, whose name was Lewis, had given a report to the patriarch. He didn't know the details, but it seemed that it was related to him. Right after, Ryan told his master that he needed to go meet his father right away, and the old man asked what was happening. The noble boy then said that it seemed that his father had found out that Chiron was his friend. He then said that if he explained everything to him, he would forgive our protagonist. He also told his master that he would train later. Nevertheless, the teacher took his sword and told Ryan that he couldn't go, which shocked the noble boy. Meanwhile, at the estate, our protagonist was kneeling in front of the patriarch, Raina, and a lot of maids and butlers, while the patriarch informed him that he would be executed. Well, you wanted to see nasty nobles, right? Be careful with what you wish, dearie. The maids began to whisper about how outrageous a friendship between a commoner and a noble was. Of course, they blamed our protagonist for his transgression. Meanwhile, Tamaran was watching everything without saying a word. Rena then asked her father to wait because she had something to tell him, but her father didn't want to listen. The head butler's report contained statements of countless employees, recording how boldly Sharon treated Rian. Furthermore, when our protagonist joined them, he knew the contents of the contract, so he shouldn't have any complaints. In fact, the patriarch asked the boy if he had something to say, and he asked what would happen to Rian because of that. That question shocked everyone, because they thought that our protagonist had not realized the situation he was in. After all, he should be begging for his life instead of worrying about Ryan. Of course, that didn't go unnoticed by Rena, but almost immediately, the patriarch insulted our protagonist, saying that he was as stupid as one would expect from a commoner, before adding that nothing would happen to the son of a noble for hanging out with the likes of Chiron. After hearing that, our protagonist sighed in relief and came clean, confessing everything. He even dared to say that they would continue being friends, which angered the patriarch, who said that it seemed that the name of Ogent didn't mean much to Sharon. The patriarch then ordered the head butler to deal with our protagonist quickly, without letting word of that be exposed in any circumstance. Right after, Rina tried to say something again, but her father cut her off again. Meanwhile, Tamaran's subordinates were lamenting how things had turned out, but they were not planning to die because of one person. In fact, they were just using some lame philosophical reasons to convince themselves that they were doing the right thing, despite the fact that they were feeling terrible. At that moment, Ryan stormed in, which made Reyna feel elated. Right after, Ryan asked who had ordered to kill his friend without his permission, and his father replied that it had been him. The noble boy then said that Sharon hadn't done anything deserving death, before adding that he had just become his friend. The patriarch then explained that you didn't always need to do something worthy of death in order to die, before adding that the affairs of nobility were so much more complicated than he could comprehend. It is not easy to understand, actually. Nobles are crap, end of story. The patriarch also said that Rian was able to benefit from being the son of a noble, because the family handled those affairs, which pissed the noble boy so much that he asked his father what the point of anything was when he had to throw away his friend. After hearing that, the patriarch got even angrier and said that, to a noble, friends needed something that they could share, before asking if he truly believed that a commoner thought of him as a friend. After all, the world was full of people who tried to earn something by grabbing onto the weakness of nobles. That made Ryan furious, and he yelled that Sharon didn't do that kind of thing, to which his father replied by asking his son to show him some proof of that claim. At that moment, Ryan realized that he had been tricked, because the moment he said that he couldn't prove it, it would be over. After all, there was no way to prove feelings, and he felt that he couldn't just give any answer. Sure, he also knew that if he were Sharon, he could give a badass answer. It was then that he looked at Sharon, and he immediately noticed that when he was sparring with him, our protagonist's look sucked everything into it. He then recalled what Chiron had told him when they were playing cards about how he might get better results by stopping obsessing over little things, and how he could glimpse at someone's intentions by observing them as a whole. Immediately thereafter, he began to try to observe his father as a whole, thinking of all the things the patriarch represented. It was then that the noble boy realized that they were not having a simple quarrel, but they were experiencing the real deal. 30 minutes prior, he was explaining to his master that his friend could die if he didn't go, and the old man understood that, but the sword master replied that Sharon was a commoner. That angered the noble boy, and he yelled at his master, reminding him that he had said that if someone could hold a conversation with a sword, then anyone could be a friend. The old man then asked Rian if he knew what the most important thing to nobility was, before adding that nobility was about wiping out anything that threatened the status of the family. The sword master then asked his pupil if he had considered the weight that he was putting on his friend's shoulders by befriending a commoner whose life was more worthless than a fly, which made Rian tremble with rage and frustration. However, the sword master didn't stop and told Ryan that he had made that child his friend with such little resolve, before adding that he shouldn't believe that he could solve things just by complaining. Ryan understood that, but he still said that he couldn't just do nothing because he had been the first one to reach out his hand to Sharon and ask to be friends. Besides, he didn't want to be a coward. At that moment, the old man thought that he liked to see that look in Ryan's eyes. Enthusiastic, honest, and pure. Sure, those were not the things that made you a great swordsman, but it gets his hopes up, and it made you cheer for his pupil. Right after, he gave Ryan his sword and told him that if he took it and went to the mansion, he would let him go, but if he was not that committed, he shouldn't even take a step from that spot. After grabbing the sword, Ryan told his master that he would never forget that debt to him, and the old man replied by saying that throwing away a friend was like throwing away yourself. Back to the present, Ryan thought that since it was the real deal, he needed to put his life on the line. Right after, he laughed out loud and said that he almost fell into his father's trap, before adding that the only proof he needed was that he believed in his friendship with Chiron. The patriarchs then said that it was not just some conflict between father and son, before adding that even as they spoke, the prestige of countless nobles was collapsing. Moreover, if it were a matter that could lead to the collapse of the family, he would even disown his son, which of course shocked everyone. Still, Rian didn't back down and replied that if he could protect his friend that way, then he would gladly leave. That pissed his father beyond belief, and the patriarch ordered the guards to take out their swords before telling his son that if he believed that Chiron was his friend, he should put his life on the line there and then. Almost immediately, Rian drew his sword, which shocked the patriarch. In fact, a big part of his anger was replaced by astonishment, and he asked his son if he dared to draw his blade against his father. Nevertheless, Rian said that he was not drawing his sword against his father, before adding that he was just proving his belief to him. The patriarch then said that Chiron couldn't be his friend, because his son didn't even get along with nobles his own age. He then added that Rian was keeping Chiron beside him to feel better about himself. However, Rian simply replied that his father was wrong before adding that Chiron was above his level, and that he wanted to help our protagonist reach higher places. The patriarchs then yelled at Chiron, asking him if he truly believed that a commoner could be friends with a noble, and our protagonist simply replied that he did not persuade Rian. Rian then told Chiron not to interfere, but our protagonist replied that it was okay not to take on everything by himself, before adding that he would take responsibility for what he needed to. After all, he was expecting that when Rian offered to be friends with him, he would need to choose between his friend and his life. Finally, Chiron said that even if he died, he didn't regret being friends with Rian. This should go straight to Netflix. Koreans making dramas. I should have seen it coming. Almost immediately, Rian said that he thought the same and added that even if he was kicked out of the family, they were friends, which shocked the patriarch. On the other hand, Raina, who had Terry eyes, thought that even if they put forward solid logic in the end, they were humans with emotions, and anybody would want a friend like that. An honest friend who wouldn't turn their back on you. Even Temuran's subordinates were crying at that point. Of course, Louis was not crying, he was just pissed. Suddenly, someone praised the storytelling he was watching as a masterpiece, which surprised everybody. Right after, Raina turned around and got very happy since her grandfather had arrived. As for the newcomer, he said, with a happy expression, that he didn't expect to see such a sight in his later years, before adding that youth was really the best. Chiron's library grind finally paid off. Rian just drew steel on his own dad, and a grandpa just called their clash a masterpiece. If you're wondering whether Chiron actually walks free, casts his first real spell, or accidentally rewrites the noble hierarchy, we're just getting started. If you guys want part 2, comment the word noble in the comments below and I'll drop it fast. Smash that like, subscribe for more, and remember, in this world, the real cheat code isn't bloodline, it's just reading ahead. Catch you in the next chapter!